Hi, welcome to the few that were able to join me. I really appreciate that. My name is Rory, and I'm a student at Penn State University in the Energy and Sustainability Policy major. Today I'll be giving a little bit of a talk, hopefully something not too incredibly boring, on the case for offshore wind in the state of Maryland. We'll be focusing on the project here in Ocean City, actually my hometown now, on the development of an offshore wind farm and how that will both affect Maryland and certain ideas that I have and proposals that I believe should be put in place to make it a possibility, as well as the real reasons why. I will take a short question and answer. If you have any questions during it, there should be to your left, there should be a message box where you can put some information, ask questions, comment as the presentation goes on, and then either as they come up or at the end, I'll take a few questions and we'll be able to hopefully answer them. So just type them there on the side. If you're seeing this then on YouTube later, simply comment below and I'll be sure to follow up. So now the United States really relies heavily on fossil and nuclear fuels to generate electricity. Renewable energy has become increasingly attractive as an alternative to them. Given concerns over climate change and difficulty in sitting nuclear power plants, health concerns associated with fossil fuel generation, as well as a desire to tap domestic energy resources, the real recognition that green energy development is likely to attract and sustain green jobs. So many states, including my home state now of Maryland, explicitly encourage renewable energy generation through Renewable Energy Portfolio Standards, RPS. These require utilities to attain a certain percentage of their electrical supply from renewable energy sources. Only a small fraction of the total U.S. electricity is generated from these renewable energy sources. In recent years, wind power has comprised the second largest fraction of newly installed power, falling only behind natural gas. Wind power has emerged as the renewable energy source of choice in many parts of the country because it is the only proven means to generate utility-scale power that is also carbon-free in a cost-competitive manner. Now, to date, all U.S. wind energy has been land-based, with much of that generation coming in Texas, California, and the Midwestern Great Plains states. Maryland itself will also soon be looking at land-based power or wind power. However, that land-based wind resources are substantially limited. For wind power to become a significant fraction of Maryland's electricity supply, it'll either need to import land-based wind power from other states and to rely on transmission lines or look out to the seas. Offshore wind power holds much promise for the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast states, including Maryland, because of its abundant resources, as well as the proximity to electric load centers rather. So although no offshore wind turbines have been installed in the U.S., offshore wind power is a proven technology and has actually over 15 years of operating experience within Europe. So serious interest in offshore wind power in the United States began around 2001 with a proposal for an offshore wind project in the Nantucket Sound just off Cape Cod, Massachusetts. Energy Management Incorporated, also known more commonly as Cape Wind, was the one behind that project, or what is now that project. So since that time, we've had many proposals that have been put forward throughout the Atlantic Gulf and the Great Lakes regions. Today, I'll focus specifically on a proposal for the state of Maryland, specifically in the region just offshore of Ocean City, Maryland. I'll go ahead now and pull up the actual presentation that we'll go through, and we'll get things started then. If you're having any technical issues, just ping me on the side. It looks like everybody's attending via the computer rather than the phone, which is great. You get to see me as well as hear me. So let me just pull up the presentation for you. And it may take a moment to load here. Okay. All right. Now, it's simply not enough for us to be opposed to coal or nuclear or other fossil fuels. If we're going to make a real impact on greenhouse gas emissions, we have to advocate for alternatives. And to make enough of an impact, that means advocating for alternatives on a utility scale. Much as all we want distributed generation and should continue to advocate for it, small wind and rooftop solar, it simply cannot supply our cities with enough power in time to prevent the worst effects of climate change. For those of us within Maryland, offshore wind offers the biggest resource at the lowest cost to consumers and with the least environmental impact. It's also a technology that's commercially available right now. Okay, we'll get into the agenda here. I'll give you a little introduction on myself. My name is Rory Spangler. Like I said earlier, I'm a student within Penn State University in the Energy and Sustainability Policy major. I'll give you a little introduction into ESP here, coming up next. Now, I have lived within Maryland now for just under a year, originating out of Pennsylvania. I'm an energy auditor for a company in Ocean City, and we work directly with utility companies, providing energy audits and home improvement through weatherization and building improvements to reduce energy throughout the Delmarva Peninsula as well as throughout Maryland. So that's just a little bit about me. I know some of you know me, so that's great. So I'll jump into what ESP is at Penn State. All right. The Energy and Sustainability Policy major. It's an online degree actually offered through the Department of Energy and Mineral Engineering, and that's within the College of Earth and Mineral Sciences at Penn State University. So I had taken some courses at Penn State for a while, actually at Penn State main campus before moving out to Ocean City, as well as finding this major, which was a very good suit for me and really what I'm interested in. Now, ESP has five core focuses, and that's energy industry knowledge, sustainability ethics, global perspective, and that really goes back to the idea that although we can do a lot ourselves, it really takes the whole world to make a big difference. And in order to really solve the issues that we face, the climate change impacts that are in our future, it won't take just one of us, but it will take all of us to really make that big difference. Another big focus is analytical skills, and something you'll see today, I hope, is communication skills. This is a government wind map. The darker colors show the best wind resources. The wind is rather good. It's pretty good in the plain states where you see all that pink right down the center. And then there's some of that also on the mountaintops. But where it's best is where you see the red and the blue areas. And those areas just happen to be along the east and the west coast, as well as the Great Lakes regions. As it turns out, those areas are actually where most of the population is. And in fact, 80% of the electrical demand comes from these regions along the coast and the Great Lakes. So you hear a lot about the press about, or a lot in the press rather, about bringing wind power from the plains and Texas to the coast. It's really, this idea is really championed by T. Boone Pickens, and it's the so-called Pickens Plan, creating this green power superhighway. Is based on the notion that we need thousands of miles of new high voltage transmission lines to carry power from the center of the country out to the coast. But the East Coast and the Great Lakes just happen to have a much better power source, right off the coast, right outside of my home window, actually. Here on the Atlantic coast, we can put wind farms 12 to 20 miles or even further than that from the shoreline, because the outer continental shelf is so shallow along most of the East Coast. In many areas, it's easily less than 30 meters deep. And because of that, that really allows the towers to be anchored right to the ocean floor using a technology that's called monopiles. This really reduces costs versus the floating technology that also exists. These are certainly shorter and anchored directly to the sea floor, providing more stability, as well as a number of other benefits, such as creating artificial reefs. Now, if those pieces look huge, it's simply because they are. Wind turbines on land really have a size constraint because you're only really able to transport those pieces by road. Once you're out on the ocean, you simply don't have that problem. So most offshore wind turbines today are rated at 3 megawatts, but the new ones are 5 megawatts or more, and designs for 10 megawatt turbines are currently in the works. The towers can be as tall as 90 meters with, that's about 300 feet, with rotor diameters, or the sweep area, of more than 120 meters. Another advantage of putting the turbines offshore is that the wind is more reliable over the ocean and usually stronger. So the wind farms are generating more energy more of the time. Land-based wind turbines usually produce about 30% of their total capacity over time, while offshore wind turbines have a capacity factor of about 45%. Now, the capacity factor, to get a little technical, is the ratio of the average actual energy generated to the design maximum, or the nameplate capacity. So a 3 megawatt turbine operating at 45% capacity generates an average of about 1.35 megawatts. And now, by comparison, the average coal plant operates at about 85% capacity. So to displace a coal plant, you would need a wind farm roughly about twice the size. So that's one thing to consider, and also one of the small drawbacks of offshore wind. Now, to give you another piece of information, a 3 megawatt offshore wind turbine would create about enough electricity to power 1,000 homes. All right, now I'll pull up this diagram here. This is really a diagram of how it works. Any number of turbines can be linked to a single cable coming ashore. Now, this is one of the major benefits of offshore wind. If you've been following cloud technology, cloud-based computing, one of the terms that's tossed around a lot is scalability, where things can grow as demand increases. The same is true for offshore wind. We can start with a 50 turbine wind farm and add turbines as more power is demanded or as more power is wanted. You simply can't do that with traditional power plants. You can't do that with a coal plant, and you certainly can't do that with a natural gas plant. So we'll get briefly into the aesthetics of offshore wind. This diagram is actually from a project in Long Island, a project that was proposed, rather. 12 nautical miles is roughly about the visual horizon. It's the point where you can't see from shore unless you have an absolute crystal clear day. And even then, you really can't see much. With the exception of the Cape Wind Project in Massachusetts, most of the proposals in the east would have the turbines out 12 miles or more. Now, the wind energy area proposed for Maryland would actually be more like 20 miles out. And you can actually see in this photo what it would look like at 4 miles, 5 miles, all the way out to about 11 miles, or really where that visual horizon is. At which point they're nearly out of sight. though of course they would still be visible on what might be a crystal clear day. That far out, they're also out of the way from other close-in coastal usage, such as well as migratory routes of shorebirds, though that's not necessarily true of all birds. So how much wind are we actually talking about? The Department of Energy estimates we have enough offshore wind that could potentially power the entire country. Now, some of that is in deep water, and obviously you can't put wind farms absolutely everywhere. But it does give you the idea of the scalability and the size of the resource. Okay. And this graph here, or this diagram actually shows the 10 states that have enough shallow water wind resources to supply their entire energy demand. You'll see it's a lot of the East Coast. Yeah, in 10 countries, as I stated earlier, before we actually began the slideshow, Europe is well ahead right now, and 10 countries in Europe already have offshore wind farms, and some of them have more than a decade of experience with them. And not to really, focus on competition, but currently China has already joined them, beating out the United States by at least several years. Now, 4 states, Massachusetts, New Jersey, Rhode Island, and Delaware, committed to projects by the end of 2009. Since then, several other states have also put in proposals. Other East Coast and Great Lakes states are studying potential projects. 2 wind developers filed applications for leases to put up wind farms just within Maryland so far. Now, the Department of Interior's Bureau of Offshore Energy Management, that's the agency formerly known as MMS, formally approved the lease of Cape Wind in Massachusetts October 2010. However, there's a small wind farm that's proposed in state waters within New Jersey, which might actually become the first operational wind farm. The reason being simply because they don't have to deal with federal regulation and permitting processes. Believe it or not, the permitting process for offshore wind, by and large and average, takes roughly about 8 years, whereas comparing that to something like natural gas, it's closer to about 2. Now, this just shows the current interest in wind energy. This shows what Maryland needs to get, or really what it needs to get to by the year 2022. It shows you solar, biomass, and onshore wind, but there's this massive gap of where we need to be and where our projections for those 3 are. That gap can obviously be filled by offshore wind. So meeting that gap, offshore wind, it represents the only immediate technology that we really have where we can go out and start building today and be able to fulfill that gap by 2022 or even before then. We'll go back to what we need to do as far as determining the proper technology. As stated earlier, we're looking at the monopile technology, the wind turbine that can actually be secured directly to the ocean floor. This just shows you a few of the available ones, as well as the location as far as how many kilometers away from the shore they actually are. You can see monopile makes up that first section of the shore and the area in which we would recommend building offshore wind for Maryland. Now, to give you a comparison, this is actually the wind area studied, and you can see there's a large amount of wind in this area for the proposed project. Now, we'll start looking at mapping the project. Where we can go with this as far as what factors we need to avoid and include. We'll start with shipping lanes. There are actually no designated shipping lanes or military activity within Zones 4, the zone where this project is set to take place. There are some exclusionary areas in Maryland's offshore waters, but they are very small. There is a fish haven. Now, this fish haven, interestingly enough, was actually a dump, which was just off Maryland shore, where they would dump older infrastructure, such as rail cars or larger pieces of concrete from demolition. Now, that municipal dump site exists within the study area. It's no longer in use, but it would not make sense to disrupt the habitat that's now formed there. Okay. We'll also look at marine exclusion zones. Nautical hazards are not only important factors to consider when estimating variable offshore wind development areas. The environmental impacts of an offshore wind project need to be studied in detail, both before construction as well as during operation. Potential impacts include avian mortality, behavioral disturbances, marine mammal impacts, fish habitat disturbance, and impact on endangered species. A study was actually conducted by Paul Kurlinger. He's the principal of Curry and Kurlinger, LLC. He's a migratory bird expert, and he determined that it would be best to have an exclusion zone about 1 nautical wide, parallel to the coastline, because migratory birds tend to follow that coastline. Okay, we'll jump into the aesthetics as well. As I stated earlier, about 12 miles out is the area where visually it becomes difficult to see. Now, a study conducted by the University of Delaware Center for Carbon-Free Power Integration did a public opinion poll. And what it found was, at 12 nautical miles out, 94% of beachgoers would continue going to that same beach. 4 would go to a different beach within the state or within the Delmarva Peninsula, and 2% would just go to a completely other beach. Now that number shrinks when you get down to 5 nautical miles. About 75 or 2/3% would remain at that beach. The closer in you get, it switches down all the way to 35% when you get within a few miles from shore. So because of that, you'd want to exclude those first few miles and really look to build anywhere from 12 miles out. That way, it has the smallest impact on tourists coming to the region. Okay, now these values illustrate the vast potential for wind power off Maryland's Atlantic coast. Now for development within the 0 to 35 meter depth range, and including that visual exclusionary zone of at least 8 to 12 miles from shore, and to allow a site the size of roughly 3,000 turbines, you could potentially supply 67% of Maryland's electric load, simply from offshore wind energy. Now, if you continue to move that out to 50 meters depth, there is the potential to fulfill 133% of Maryland's load. Now, of course, this changes the technology from the monopile structures. So that is a potential for down the road, but with the technology that's simple and available immediately, easily 67% of Maryland's electrical load could be met. Now, let's look at cost. Offshore wind can be a much better investment than new coal-fired electrical plants. Now, this slide is from a similar project done in Virginia from a research group, VCERC, and it shows offshore wind generated electricity prices compared to the price of electricity from a new coal-fired plant or a gas-fired power plant. Now, fuel prices are the biggest variable in determining price competitiveness. If you assume coal will resume its pre-recession price rate, or if you include a carbon price, offshore wind will be cheaper over the life of the wind farm. Natural gas is currently very cheap, but has a history of volatility. Now, there are a lot of factors that influence wind farm cost, including whether the utility finances the project, whether the turbines are manufactured in the United States or abroad, what capacity factor you assume. Other researchers using less optimistic assumptions have come up with higher prices for offshore wind and lower prices for coal. Now, for states that have renewable portfolio standards, such as Maryland, the price of wind is effectively cheaper than you see here because of the new market for renewable energy certificates. Now, you also get price stability. As I mentioned earlier, fossil fuels have a history of being of volatility. This is coal, Central Appalachian coal, daily spot prices, and those coal prices can go up and down, but the price of wind will always be zero. Predictability is hugely important to business success. Using fossil fuels to generate electricity is almost like taking out an adjustable rate mortgage that you can never get out of. Consumers have to pay for fuel price increases for the whole life of the plant, as well as extra costs that might be needed, say paying a carbon tax or putting in additional emission controls to fight global warming. Using wind power is like taking out a fixed rate mortgage and locking in stable prices decades into the future. And one thing to hit on real quick is sometimes wind is not going to blow, and we do need energy all the time. And those are two big issues. One is really a day-to-day variable. Offshore wind is much steadier than land-based wind, but of course it still fluctuates. The other issue is more seasonal. Wind is stronger during the winter months and really drops off during the summer. For the near term, neither one matters a ton. A recent government report concluded the transmission grid can already handle up to 20% wind power without a problem, and it will take at least 10 years to install that many wind turbines. Utilities already rely on natural gas and other fuels that can generate extra power on demand, such as when we have a real hot summer day and everybody must have their home cool, so they're using their AC. There's other forms too. We've got solar, and that really makes a perfect complement to wind. So that's one of the ways that we can really address the issue of having to deal with sort of the fluctuation in wind. Here's another great thing. Offshore wind can be connected to other wind farms across the East Coast. So what might be built in Maryland will connect to what's called the Atlantic Wind Project. And this project runs from New England, rather New York, down to Virginia, the Hampton Roads area. And this allows certain offshore wind powers to tap into these lines and be able to generate electricity through them. This transmission line will run, from New York to Virginia, allowing power to be sold to other utilities within those regions. So I spoke a little bit about the downsides. We have some data from Europe that's really reassuring, but we simply can't be complacent. It's still our duty, the duty of many environmental groups, to study the impacts and make sure it's comprehensively done. When you're mapping out the ocean floor, you need to be able to locate sensitive species, and you need to know migratory routes, whales and other mammals and fish. We're told that so far indications for mammals that they move out of areas during construction and then return. We unfortunately should expect that birds will be killed, though the hope is that it's not many. Most coastal birds aren't ranging 12 miles out. Certainly there are some migratory birds that fly across the open ocean, but from what we've seen in European data is that these birds actually will start to avoid the area. And we'll see here, this is a Danish study of a wind farm that was situated in a known migratory bird flyway. And you can see that the birds eventually started to make their way around the wind farm. So the hope is that that will be the case. Now the impacts on fishing are a bit more mixed. Commercial fishermen who use half-mile-long nets certainly can't operate around turbines. So there is an impact there. Now, sport fishermen will see the benefit because the turbines create those artificial reefs, creating habitat for fish. Another interesting note, from talking to a few people here in Ocean City, especially tour guides, one thing that they thought would be really neat about having this project here is being able to take tourists out while they're on boat tours of the area out to the actual wind farm. So that might be a benefit of the offshore wind, a secondary benefit. Now, the upsides going off that are very obvious. When you get your electricity offshore from wind turbines instead of dirty fossil fuels, there's simply no pollution or very little. No risk of mercury poisoning, toxic sludge washing up on beaches, and certainly no ash spills burying houses and fouling rivers. Wind turbines, they don't cause asthma, they don't produce radioactive waste, and they don't require mountaintop coal mining. We'll look at this table real quick. This is pretty self-explanatory, but it summarizes the pollution case for renewable energy. Now, one of the best things about offshore wind is they mean jobs. It is a labor-intensive business, and that's a big selling point for politicians and locals in the area. There are 8,000 components of a wind turbine, and they can all be made within the U.S. In fact, there was talk, and there still is talk, about bringing a manufacturing plant to the neighboring town of Salisbury, Maryland, easily adding thousands of jobs. And these are career-length jobs that will be to the state of Maryland. They're skilled jobs, and they simply can't be exported overseas. And then it comes down to the fact of how will the public support offshore wind. Another survey actually conducted by the University of Delaware found that 3/4 of the state's population supported an offshore wind project. And now this was done back in 2010, before Sandy came into play, and before we really started taking a deeper look into climate change. Now, when offered a choice between the offshore wind project or the equivalent of a new coal power plant or natural gas, over 90% of the respondents voted for wind, even if it were to cost slightly more. Okay, so what does it take to get here? And this is where we get to the real juice of this proposal or this presentation. The fastest way for offshore wind farms to become a reality is for costs to come down. Lots of people are working for this, including not just developers here and abroad, but also the Department of Energy with grants for R&D and the United States Congress with production tax credits. But we've already discussed why offshore wind is a good deal right now in terms of reducing pollution and carbon emissions, as well as creating jobs. So there are other ways that the state could incentivize wind farms off our coast starting today. Unfortunately, our current RPS won't get us all the way there. It certainly might make leaders think that they're making a big change and competing with Europe, but the simple fact is we aren't. And although we are kidding ourselves, we aren't kidding manufacturers and developers who need incentives in order to build and make offshore wind a reality. Here's a few things that can be done. as far as the executive government of Maryland, there are a few things we need to focus on, and that's building a campaign to influence public opinion. As stated by the Delaware study, most people are already willing and want offshore wind versus another coal or natural gas plant. We can hold community information sessions to give the general public greater knowledge about the benefits of offshore wind, much like this presentation. These can be held in town halls or webinars, much like this. And that also gets feedback from the locals and what concerns they wish to have addressed. As well, commercial television should have campaigns providing positive stakeholder information. Provide factual information regarding the project. There's a lot of misinformation out there about wind, that it's noisy and dangerous, but the simple fact is it's clean, renewable energy that doesn't fluctuate in cost and creates thousands of jobs and will be here for years. So a few other things. Again, open discussion with builders and developers. Simply put, builders and developers are not given the grants and the funding needed to make this happen. And that needs to change if we expect this to happen. And to start, we need to open discussions with those builders and developers. And we need to build alliances with similar stakeholders who have desires as we do to make wind power a reality. And that involves, not just working with the locals, but also working with utility companies as well to find out what needs they need addressed in order to make wind energy possible. So what to do? These are some of the ideas that I am promoting to make offshore wind a reality. We've talked about why we need a mandatory incentive and grant program through the RPS. Now, another way to incentivize wind is to tell our utility regulator, the State Corporation Commission, to consider pollution and healthcare costs when they evaluate proposals for new electric generation. Now, these costs are referred to as externalities. They're the real cost of burning coal and other fossil fuels, but they aren't costs that utility has to pay. If you take them into account, though, renewables become an incredibly cheaper option. And finally, you, the taxpayer, are currently giving tax credits and even outright cash to the utilities and the coal companies to thank them for blowing up our mountains. Removing those subsidies would be a small step towards leveling the playing field for wind energy against fossil fuels. Okay, I'll take a few questions. So I don't believe I have any here. Let's see. Okay, that's a good one. Yeah, the question, I don't know if it will show up in the YouTube video or not, but the question is that even with incentives, won't wind energy always be more expensive than traditional? I think the answer is no. Most entities and those actively involved in offshore wind power have the belief that wind power will drop significantly over time. And we can see that actually from information we've received from Europe as well as actually China. So I think the answer is no. Currently, yes, it is certainly more expensive, but in time, we'll see a change. And my belief is that given a few years of actual offshore development, we will see a cost decrease. I'll take any other questions that pop up. If not, hopefully it was very informative, and I'll certainly take any questions that might arise via the YouTube page. You're welcome to post comments there, and I'll be happy to respond to them. You can also email me. It's not in the slide, but it's a simple email. It's Rory, R-O-R-Y, @psu.edu. So thank you, and it was certainly A pleasure, and I hope it wasn't too boring. But I really hope you join me in continuing this effort to really educate the public and our legislators at both federal and state that offshore wind is good for the state, it's good for our region, and it's ultimately good for our country and the entire world. Thank you.